Hello and welcome to your screencast that will cover the endocrine, urinary, lymphatic, and immune systems in the cadaver lab. We're going to start off with our endocrine system. One of the first structures is the thyroid gland, and we'll see if we can find one of these within the lab. The medical students haven't prosected the neck just yet, but we have a couple cadavers that we can open up and find the thyroid gland. On our thyroid gland, you will have two lobes, one on the right and one on the left, and a isthmus that will join them together. So it's the center portion over here. Sometimes the thyroid gland can have a pyramidal lobe, and it typically will be in the center over here and will be triangular shaped, but a little bit long, just kind of how I've drawn it over there. And that is only found in a certain portion of the population. It is estimated that about 10 to 30% of our population has this pyramidal lobe of our thyroid gland. Now let's take a look at what it would look like in the cadaver. So in order to see this gland, we will have to, of course, dissect the skin away in the neck and the platysma, and then we have this group of muscles below the hyoid bone, which we see right over here, that is called the infrahyoid muscles. We need to reflect the sternohyoid muscle. We also need to reflect the sternothyroid muscle, which is deep to this one. I think we have it coming up in another picture. And we can also reflect the omohyoid, which sits a bit more lateral, or we could just kind of pull it more laterally so we could see the gland a bit better. And we have no need to dissect away the thyrohyoid muscle that would be sitting deep to this muscle over here, because it would be found superior to the thyroid gland. So don't worry about knowing the infrahyoid muscle names. I just wanted you to be aware that they are in this location, and we will cover them in our muscular system. So here is a picture of those muscles reflected. Here is our sternothyroid muscle that's reflected. We also have the sternohyoid muscle that has been reflected superficial to that. And here is our thyroid gland. You can kind of see that butterfly shape to it. And we have this pyramidal lobe that was identified on this cadaver, and there's the isthmus that joins the two lobes of the thyroid gland together. Now we also have the superior thyroid artery that we need to know on the thyroid gland. So that is going to branch off of this external carotid artery. Remember, down here off of the aorta, we would have the common carotid artery, and that would split into, at about the level of the superior border of the thyroid cartilage, it's going to split into the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. So off of this external carotid artery that supplies the neck and the head, or I should really say the neck and the face, we're going to have a branch called the superior thyroid artery. So you can follow it over here, and it goes to supply the thyroid gland. And so here is a little outline of where that artery lies. So now let's talk about the parathyroid glands, which we will find on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. This is a posterior view, so what you're looking at is the esophagus inferiorly, but superiorly this would be your pharynx. And so the thyroid gland wraps around that pharynx, and posteriorly we will find the parathyroid glands. We can have 4 up to 8 parathyroid glands. We'll see if we're lucky enough to see these in lab. Here is a view of what they could possibly look like. So they've cut the thyroid gland here, and you could see the parathyroid glands. These are quite large. They almost look like adenomas, but we'll see what we are lucky to see in the lab. For instance, this is an example of what a parathyroid gland can look like, depending on what condition glands are left in after being embalmed and the formalin entering the tissue. So we'll see how beautiful they're going to look in our lab. Let's talk about the adrenal glands. They're going to sit on the superior pole of the kidney, and we know that on the periphery they will have a cortex and internally they will have a medulla, but we will not be dissecting these glands in order to see those two different layers. Here's how they will look in the cadaver lab. Typically, if we are looking at an adrenal gland, it will be inside the body. You'll find your kidney, and then sitting atop will be the adrenal or suprarenal gland. Next, we have the pancreas, which you should be familiar with. Here we could see the duodenum that is cradling the head of the pancreas. Then we have the body of the pancreas and the tail that would point to the spleen. So this is a nice little outline of the pancreas. Once again, you are familiar with it and you know that it is a exocrine and endocrine gland. The next three structures we will look at are part of the brain. So the first gland we will take a look at is the pineal gland, and that is highlighted for you in yellow here. The way I like to identify this in lab is I look for the thalamus, which I know it's a structure we haven't quite seen yet, but I look for the thalamus, which is this oval-shaped structure, and it has a little knob in the center, and we'll learn all about this in our nervous system. But posterior to that, you will find a little gland that is like a teardrop shape to it. So that's our pineal gland. I also double check and look for the corpus callosum. Again, I know you haven't learned the structure just yet, but at the very back of the corpus callosum, you will find inferior to that will be your pineal gland. Now for our pituitary gland and hypothalamus, I use the thalamus as a reference again. So here's that oval-shaped thalamus with the little knob in the center, and then the triangular portion of that inferiorly and anteriorly to the thalamus, you will find your hypothalamus. And if we look at the center extension of this hypothalamus, we will run into your pituitary gland. Now, a lot of the brains that we take out in the cadaver lab will not have the pituitary gland attached. That is because we have a diaphragm that covers this portion of the pituitary gland. It's actually a dural fold that we will discuss in the nervous system. And so when we go to pull the brain out of the cranial cavity, this diaphragm or dural fold holds it in place and keeps it within the cranial cavity. And so that's how you're going to identify it. So I just wanted to give you some more cadaver images of what this will look like. Here we could see the triangular space of the hypothalamus. Right over here, superior to that, we have the thalamus that I keep using as a reference point. And then posterior to the thalamus, here is your pineal gland. Here's another cadaver view. Again, we won't really see this view in our cadaver lab, but you will see the pituitary gland inferior to your hypothalamus, which would be over here, and superior to that is your thalamus. Also, as a reminder, the bony structure it sits within is the sella turcica, a part of the sphenoid bone, and inferior to that sella turcica is our sphenoid sinus. It's all coming together. Like I said, that dural fold that we discussed superior to your pituitary gland will hold the pituitary gland in the sella turcica so that when we remove the brain from the cranial cavity, it still sits within the sella turcica in the cranial cavity. This is the view that you will see in the cadaver lab to identify the pituitary gland. So that is your pituitary gland right over there. I always like to first identify your optic nerves, which of course are heading over from the eye, and posterior to that in the center, in the mid-sagittal plane, will be your pituitary gland. Now let's jump into your urinary system. The first thing we need to discuss is where these kidneys lie. You will have the right kidney sit just a bit lower than the left kidney. but they will be surrounded with the same supportive tissues. Your first layer you will run into, if you are dissecting this area, it's already dissected for you most likely, is the renal fascia. So this is going to be this area that kind of surrounds, I would say, more of the retroperitoneal area. We have an anterior and posterior aspect, and they come together laterally. Now, just deep to that, we will have the perirenal fat capsule, and this is typically quite a bit of fat. It's really rare that we don't have a lot of fat surrounding the kidneys because they really help to cushion and support and protect the kidneys. Right on the actual kidney itself, we will have the fibrous capsule. And so this is the capsule that you will be identifying in lab because it's probably the only one left on the kidney. This is just a cadaveric image for you to see this. This kidney has been cut in the frontal plane. We see the capsule adhered to the kidney tissue right in this area over here. Next, we're going to discuss the renal hilum, or you can also call this the renal hilus. This is just the medial aspect of our kidney where we see structures entering and exiting. In this case, we would have your renal veins exiting, your renal arteries entering, and your ureters exiting, heading on down to the urinary bladder. If we were to cut the kidney in a frontal plane, you would start to see that it has almost different layers. The one that is most on the periphery of the kidney is your renal cortex. Now, the area that's highlighted in green is all cortical tissue, meaning it's all tissue that we find within the cortex. But technically, the renal cortex is just this peripheral region that I've highlighted in purple. If we look internal to that cortex, we would have your renal medulla. So that is both the renal columns that you saw highlighted in the previous slide that is made up of cortical tissue, and it includes what is new to us, these medullary pyramids. And so the tissue, the renal columns, would be the cortical tissue that sits between these medullary pyramids right in here. So all of this would be your medulla in this region. At the very tip of your medullary pyramids, you will have the renal papilla, which is highlighted in green for you here. These renal papilla will have the very end of the collecting duct, which we will get into in the lecture portion of our urinary system. It'll have the very end of the collecting duct, which is collecting all of your filtrate that basically is becoming the urine that we will be excreting from our body. So from this tip here, that urine will move into an area that we will learn next called the minor calyces. But before we get into that, all of this area beyond the cortex, beyond the medulla, is called the renal sinus. So it's just a space where we will find some structures that I will identify in the next slides. So here are minor calyces. These are one of the structures that belong inside our renal sinus. And you can see the very tip of the renal papilla here would drain into these minor calyces. So here's a renal papilla draining into this minor calyce. Same thing here. Papilla into the minor calyce. And if we wanted to say minor calyce in a singular form, we would call that the minor calyx. So this is a minor calyx. All of these minor calyces are then going to drain into major calyces. So they're just larger tubes, and they are going to congregate together to move that urine into what's known as the renal pelvis, which is more of this funnel-shaped structure, and distal to that will be the ureter. So at this point, we can see the ureter exiting, and it'll continue on down. It's about 25 centimeters long, and it'll enter the urinary bladder. So before we discuss the urinary bladder, I want to talk about some vasculature of our kidney. We've already discussed the renal artery and vein, but let's just review it to make sure we're all on the same page. So coming from the aorta, the abdominal aorta, we are going to give blood supply to the kidney. This will bring in oxygenated blood into the kidney for it to be filtered, and we'll discuss the full details of how blood travels in the lecture portion of the urinary system. So from our renal artery, we will go through more arteries into our arterioles. We actually have 2 capillary beds. We'll move through in a more microscopic portion of the kidney, and then the venules will lead to veins, and specifically what we see here is your left renal vein, and that will drain into your inferior vena cava, which we know will take that blood back to the heart. So here's a bit more detail as to how that blood is going to flow. Again, the renal artery comes off of the abdominal aorta. It will split into segmental arteries. I forgot I had this highlighted. So we have our segmental arteries, which, by the way, we do not have segmental veins that will correspond with these. From these segmental veins, we will move into our interlobar arteries, and that will then turn into arcuate arteries, which, if we're lucky, we'll see these in lab, but most likely we will not. Those arcuate arteries will then turn into cortical, there's my mouse, cortical radiate arteries that will be in the region of the cortex. At this point, it will then branch into a afferent arteriole that will give blood over into our glomerulus, and at this point, filtration is going to start taking place. The blood will then exit, or I shouldn't say exit, it'll move through the efferent arteriole into a capillary system. And the capillary system that can exist are your peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, and we'll talk about the difference in class. From there, we are then going to lead the blood into venules that will carry it to our cortical radiate vein. That'll come back to an arcuate vein, which will lead into a interlobar vein. Remember, we're skipping segmental veins because they don't exist, and instead those interlobar veins will go straight into the renal vein to drain into inferior vena cava that will travel back to the heart. Here is a cadaver view of what these arteries look like. Here's your renal artery leading in. That will then give branch to segmental arteries, which will branch into interlobar arteries. And then if we're lucky, we will find some arcuate arteries that will arc around the medullary pyramid and then give branches to cortical radiate arteries. Leaving the kidney, we will have urine that will go into the renal pelvis. We will find this right in the area of the hilum, and that leads into your ureter, which will bring that urine down to your urinary bladder. So let's pick up over there. Here's your ureter once again that you will find in the posterior abdominal cavity. Notice how it is traveling over this big muscle here known as your psoas major. Once it gets to your urinary bladder, you will have orifices in which the urine will move from the ureter into the urinary bladder. Now this area, if we draw a line from each of the ureteric orifices and lines down to your internal urethral sphincter, it forms a triangle. And this triangle is known as your trigone. It's kind of the pathway that urine will take in order to empty out the body. In your urinary bladder, we also will have this muscle called the detrusor muscle. I love that name. It sounds like a superhero. DETRUSOR is here to save the day. Anyway, so this detrusor muscle, when it contracts, it will cause the bladder to empty. And the internal urethral sphincter we already discussed. We will find that right in this area where the neck of the bladder is found and the very inferior point of our trigone. So here's a cadaveric image of a bladder that has been cut open. You could see the urethral openings here, or the ureteric orifices. So if we draw a line across here and also down over to our internal urethral sphincter, which isn't really shown in this picture because it is covered with tissue, but we would find it in the areas where I have the blue arrows. So if we were to draw a line down from those ureter openings, we would have our triangle here. That would be our trigone. And our detrusor muscle, once again, will be found all around the bladder in this region. And since we have this cadaveric image of a female up, again, this is a mid-sagittal cut. Just to orientate you, this is our urinary bladder. Inferior to this, we have the ureter, following it here. Anterior to this is your pubic symphysis, so this is our pubic bone over here. And notice how your bladder sits superior to this pubic symphysis. Posterior to your urinary bladder, we have the uterus, and inferior to your uterus is the vagina. So this would be the vaginal orifice over here. This would be the external urethral orifice. And then posterior to the vagina, we have the rectum, and then inferiorly the anus. So I wanted to illustrate for you further the external urethral sphincter and the internal urethral sphincter. When we look at the bladder, right where we see the neck of the bladder, we will have the internal urethral orifice, and the internal urethral sphincter will be found external to that orifice. And this is made up of smooth muscle, so it is involuntary control for us. If we go further down the urethra, right at the area of the pubis, we have the external urethral sphincter. And this is made up of skeletal muscle, so it is under voluntary control. And the urethra is going to be much longer within a male. So you can see within a female, if we go back to this cadaver picture, it's quite short, whereas if we look at it in a male, we have quite the long path in order for that urine to leave via the external urethral orifice. So let's look at our bladder here, and then at this point is where we would have our internal urethral sphincter. The prostate surrounds the urethra here, so when you hear that somebody has an enlarged prostate, they typically have issues urinating because it impinges upon this area of the urethra, and this is called your prostatic part of the urethra. Do not worry about the pre-prostatic part of the urethra just yet. We will talk about that next quarter when we discuss the reproductive system. Beyond the point of the prostate, we have your membranous urethra, and within this area, or surrounding this area, we will find the external urethral sphincter. Beyond that membranous urethra, we will have the urethra sit within what's known as the corpus spongiosum of the penis, and so this is called, rightfully so, the spongy urethra, or it's also known as the penile urethra. So here is a cadaveric view of this urethra. You can see the bladder is highlighted in green, And so just below that area, we will see the prostatic urethra. The prostate is more of this white region in here. And so the urethra that lies within it is called the prostatic urethra. Beyond that, we have the membranous urethra, which is quite short. And once we start to see that corpus spongiosum tissue, we will know that that is our penile or spongy urethra. Now let's jump into the lymphatic and immune systems. The first structures we will discuss are the thoracic duct and your cisterna chyli. 3/4 of your body is drained by the thoracic duct. From the lower aspect of your body, we will have lymph that will move through certain trunks, and I'm not holding you responsible for knowing the names of these trunks in the cadaver lab, but here you have your right lumbar trunk that will drain the right lower portion of your body, and your left lumbar trunk that will drain the left portion of your lower body, and an intestinal trunk that, of course, is draining your intestines. And it brings it all into this lymphatic sac here, known as the cisterna chyli. And that will bring lymph into your thoracic duct that will travel up intermediate between the azygous vein and your hemiazygous vein system and accessory hemiazygous veins. You'll also find it intermediate to the descending aorta. And so that thoracic duct will continue superiorly, and eventually it will drain into the junction of your left internal jugular vein and your left subclavian vein. And this is called your left venous arch because it is draining right at the junction of these two veins. And of course, once it enters our veins, that will be carried through this left brachiocephalic vein into the superior vena cava into the heart. So here's what it'll look like in a cadaver. I apologize, this picture is blurrier than what I thought it would look like, but we can identify the descending aorta over here. This is superior, this is inferior, this is to the left, and this is to the right. So our descending aorta is sitting right here. We also see the azygous vein. This thoracic duct has been displaced just a little bit. It should be sitting more in between or intermediate between these two structures rather than further on the right side. And so as you look at this thoracic duct inferiorly, you can see the cisterna chyli, and they've also identified the lumbar trucks that we discussed previously. Here's a clearer view of what this should look like. You have your azygous vein over here. The descending aorta has been dissected out, so what we can see here is your hemiazygous vein. The accessory hemiazygous we can't see too well over here, but notice how this thoracic duct is sitting in between those veins or intermediate to those veins. Now let's discuss the thymus. The thymus is usually just more of like a fatty piece of tissue that sits over the heart in the cadavers that we see, but the thymus was once a thriving piece of lymphatic tissue that was helping to mature our T lymphocytes or our T cells. And so the area we can find this is sitting on the heart. It has two lobes, just like the thyroid gland, but careful not to mix up the thymus and the thyroid gland, which is why I chose a picture that shows both of them. The thyroid gland sits in the area of the trachea, and I like to call it the bow tie of the body, whereas the thymus sits on top of the heart, the superior aspect of the heart. So here is the heart down in this region, and the thymus is sitting on the superior aspect of that, and it is also colored in yellow over here. Now let's talk about the tonsils. We've learned that we have 3 different tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsil will be at the roof of the nasopharynx. The palatine tonsils will be in the oral cavity. Actually, this arrow is pointing more to the uvula than the tonsil. The palatine tonsil should be right in this region. It's properly identified in this picture here, where we're going to see an anterior and a posterior pillar that it sits in between. And then lastly, we have your lingual tonsil that will be found at the base of the tongue posteriorly. So what'll that look like in a cadaver? If we are able to do a mid-sagittal cut on a cadaver, we will be able to see the spaces that contain these tonsils. So here is our nasopharynx, and you can see in the roof here we have the pharyngeal tonsil. We also would be able to see the opening of the pharyngeotympanic tube, or we know this as the auditory tube or eustachian tube. Here's another mid-sagittal cut of the head. And if you look at the tongue, you may notice, wow, that's really muscular. But we want to focus on that back portion of the tongue where we will find the lingual tonsil. And lastly, in the oral cavity, we will look for the anterior and posterior pillars. To learn some more fancy anatomical terms, that anterior pillar is also known as the palatoglossal arch, and the posterior pillar is known as the palatopharyngeal arch. And in between those arches, or those pillars, we would find the palatine tonsil. Now to discuss lymph nodes, these nodes are located all throughout the body, and it really depends on the cadaver if we are going to be able to find any in order to identify. But the three most prominent areas we can search for these lymph nodes will be in the neck, the axilla, and the inguinal region. And so we might see them look something like this. Here in the area of the neck, surrounding your submandibular gland, we will look for submandibular lymph nodes. They almost look like a brownish or sometimes black pigmented nodule, or we can also look for your submental lymph node. You've already seen the spleen, but I just wanted to remind you that if we look inferior to the diaphragm on the left side, so this would be your left upper quadrant, you will find your spleen, and you also have seen your appendix that comes off of the cecum here. So that is the end of your screencast for your lab. This covered laboratories 4, 5, and 6. So hopefully we'll find all these structures in the cadaver lab, and if we are missing some, your lab list will be updated.